Okay, next up we're going to move on to basically the Ruin Storm and the whole Calth scenario. So we'll be talking about the World Eaters, the Word Bearers, and the Ultramarines. Let's start with the Word Bearers. For me, without a doubt, the Word Bearers and their lore and their involvement in the Heresy is a solid S tier. They're at the top. The flavor is real. The flavor is all over the place. There are so many books that involve and feature the Word Bearers, and they're just really, really well done, and they're interesting in very different ways. The First Heretic is a fantastic story about basically the transition of the Word Bearers into the monsters that everyone learns about them to be. Argel Tall is a really awesome character, that possessed Marine. Erebus is everyone's least favorite 30k character, but hey, you gotta have that hated character, and he does provide a lot of fantastic target. You know, the memes are endless about Erebus and how much everybody hates the guy. He's got a very punchable face, but it's perfect. And then of course you've got Lorgar. Lorgar, who is this really, Lorgar starts off by loving the Emperor and worshipping the Emperor, and then being denied by the Emperor in his ability to worship him. And so he out of spite, out of pettiness, out of sadness, rejection, whatever, he goes and looks for the next best thing. And he finds something. Lorgar also gets a bunch of really interesting moments in which he gets to interact with a lot of his other brother Primarchs in ways that are really, again, like I said before, he gets to serve as an interesting foil and comparison character for a lot of those. He has great moments with Angron, Magnus, Horus to a limited extent, Gilliman. In almost every section of the Horus Heresy novel series, you can find a word bearer who is, somehow involved making the thing more flavorful. And sometimes they are even more mustache twirly than the Night Lords can be. And a lot of times they can be. But there's also lots of other great characters who are just really awesome, really fun to hate. Corferon, Erebus, even down to little characters. Oh gosh, what's that guy's name? The Chaplain Inzar, I think, who is in Echoes of Eternity, who is like talking to Kargos, the failed apothecary from the World Eaters, and just like cheering him on as he's, losing his mind to bloodlust and becoming a full-on Khorne berserker. It's just so fun. They're so great. And they're another legion that, again, if not for me having a buddy who has like 6,000 points of them, I would consider a Word Bearer's army. I don't see as many of them as I would like, and they're a really essential part of the story. S tier for sure, without a question. And you know what? This leads us to another S tier legion, the World Eaters. They belong right at the top with their lore as well. When you think of grimdark and depressing, inevitable falls and destruction, tragic, you can't look anywhere else other than Angron. It's so good you can ignore the fact that his name is Angron, which is a really stupid name. The decision for the World Eaters Legion to take on the Butcher's Nails, those implants which cause the same sort of problems and bloodlust that Angron himself has, the decision to do so just so that they can try to understand their Primarch, the fact that Karn features so prominently within all these stories. Karn, who's probably a top 5 character in the Horus Heresy saga entirely. It all adds up to really great storytelling. And it starts off good. Again, they're there at the beginning. They're there present for Istvan 3. They really start to shine in the Ruin Storm and Calth scenario with Betrayer and a couple of other things. And then they're present at the Siege, and they're a really big part of that as well. Now, one thing that I would say, if I was asked, and I'm not, but I'm going to say it anyway because I'm sitting here in front of a microphone, I get a little tired of the sheer bloodthirsty insanity of the World Eaters. I find them a little bit less interesting than some of the other Chaos Legions that still have the ability to think more clearly. It is pretty funny that in the Siege of Terra, basically the World Eaters are having a hard time operating their vehicles because they can't find anyone who wants to drive because everyone else would have to be running, and just, swinging chain axes at everything. But that one-note nature, by the time we get there, is a little bit less interesting. For me, they really peak in the Ruinstorm saga, and it's really all about Betrayer. Betrayer, by the way, ended up being a top favorite book, easily top 2, most voted for in the survey that I took. And again, as with other books that were popular like Legion, this book did not have any trend of, it wasn't just like World Eaters players who said that. It's just a very solid story. Part of it, again, is because of the companion story and the strength of the first Heretic and the depth of interesting stuff that's going on with the word bearers as well. Erebus gets to be a bad guy in that one. Argel Tall gets to be a really interesting character. Gilliman shows up and is awesome as well. It's a loaded book. There's so many good moments and character developing moments for so many different characters. There is a moment, showdown between Lorgar, Angron, and Gilliman in Betrayer, which I'm actually going to save and talk about for the Ultramarines section coming up next, but it's one of my favorite in the entirety of the series. Regardless, the World Eaters are always there. They're present throughout all of it. They have really deep, tragic pathos. They've got interesting supporting characters. Latara Sarin, which I haven't even talked about her, but the Captain of the Conqueror is her entire own thing of awesomeness in this book and others. She shows up in Echoes of Maternity in a way that is real grim. It's awesome, but it's a lot. But World Eaters, easy decision, S tier. So the last part of that little trifecta is, of course, the Ultramarines. Can't talk about the Ruinstorm and Calth without talking about the Ultramarines, so let's do it. So first of all, I would like to say that historically I have hated the Ultramarines. I thought they're boring. They're the poster boys. I thought they were generic, whatever else. Until I read No Fear. No Fear is, it should be considered a contender in any discussion for the best book in all of the Horus Heresy. It's very, very good. It's well paced. It describes the attack on Calth. The writing is just good. It's tense. It's well done. It's executed interestingly, on top of just the story that is being pushed out there. I have to say this, though. Let's just put the rating out here now, and I'll explain myself. Because despite that glowing endorsement of No Fear, which if you haven't read it, you should read it, okay? You need to read it. The Ultramarines belong near the top of the A category. They do not make it into my S tier. Let me explain. So, No Fear does, in fact, change my entire perception about the Ultramarines. Take them from a very silly, boring milquetoast legion and make them something very cool. Right before Calth happens, there's a lot of optimism in the Ultramarines. They're looking at the end of the Great Crusade. Gilliman is trying to think about what his soldiers are going to become in Macragge. What are you going to transition to in peacetime? How are you going to best serve humanity? All that very interesting stuff. And then, of course, we know that's not going to happen. Everything falls apart, etc., etc. There are just some really great moments that the Ultramarines are involved in for this arc. And now we'll talk about it. In Betrayer, there is a moment when, after everything that happens on Calth, we get to see Gilliman coming for Lorgar. And the payoff is excellent. And it feels good to see Gilliman stand in front of Lorgar and attempt to exact vengeance for what happened at Calth. There's a moment there in Betrayer when Lorgar looks at Gilliman and sees hatred in Gilliman's eyes. Now, the reason this is interesting is because there was always a thing between Gilliman and Lorgar because the Ultramarines were the ones that were tasked with destroying Monarchia after the Emperor decided that the word bearers, the way they were teaching the worship of the Emperor, was antithetical to the Imperial truth. And Lorgar hated Gilliman then, after what he did. But Lorgar has this moment of realization after Calth that Gilliman never hated him until then, until he did this thing. And, Lorgar's whole set of motivation, this belief that Lorgar had of inferiority and whatever else in the face of his other brother Primarchs, it was entirely misplaced and misunderstood. And that's a really fascinating thing that that Guilliman gets to be a part of all of that. Now, my biggest problem for the Ultramarines, and it's not really a problem, it's the same sort of thing that some of the other legions face. Guilliman isn't at the siege, and he can't be a part of that big part of the story. And if you can tell so far, I've been weighting pretty heavily some of these ratings on, how much legions do at the Siege of Terra. And part of the reason for this, to be quite honest, is that a lot of the other things, a lot of the other elements are built up to this moment. Some of the books in that 50-book series do in fact feel like filler. And I'm not saying that the Calth Ruinstorm arc or Shadow Crusade arc is filler, but it's just not as immediately relevant as what happens in the siege in the end. And because the Ultramarines can't necessarily be a part of that, they have some fantastic things, some fantastic characters, but they're largely left out of the most important part of the whole heresy, which of course is the siege. And so, unfortunately, they suffer for it just a little bit. Now, maybe this will help some of your wounded pride Ultramarine players and fans, because the next Legion we're going to talk about, the Blood Angels, similarly end up in the A tier and behind, in my opinion, the Ultramarines. Now, when we're talking about the importance of the Siege of Terra, let's be honest, the Blood Angels are all over the siege. They're everywhere. But for my money, I just don't find them as immediately interesting as some of the other legions that are involved. The Blood Angels are great, and the story and the tragedy, the upcoming tragedy of Sanguinius, is a fascinating and a crucial and essential part of the heresy. But I feel like the Blood Angels are largely sidelined or just not really developed as much in the novel series, at least until they get thrown into the siege, and then they're very important. Fear to Tread is a book. I enjoyed reading it, but it was not one of the more exciting books in the Horus Heresy. It certainly didn't show up on anyone's favorite list. I mean, the Cygnus battle, Kabanda versus Sanguinius, it's iconic and it's important for the setting and the lore at large. But, the Blood Angels, for me, they feel largely pocketed and then, kept there waiting at Terra for the final thing. It's not saying I don't enjoy them, because I like Raldoran. Amit gets a really interesting moment, a couple of really interesting moments in Echoes of Eternity, which I really appreciated, and I think I'm going to have to, I really want to make that model, something with him and with his knife. But do they carry as much water as some of these other legions? I don't think so. I think A tier is pretty good, though. They're entertaining stuff. There's places and stories you can read for them, but it's just not up to the highest level. We are entirely off the rails at this point. We're going in no particular order for the rest of these legions, because a lot of the other ones, they exist in their own little pockets, sub-whatevers that are going on. I could have put the Dark Angels next to the Night Lords because they're so intertwined in the Thramis Crusade, but I chose not to, because the Dark Angels don't belong in that discussion at that point. The Dark Angels are similarly thorped. They're in the D tier. Man, they've got a couple of novels early on in the early series, and you would think that would be an opportunity to do something interesting. But man, there are some real stinkers in the Dark Angels stories. One of the things that's interesting is, as opposed to some of the others arcs that seem to be written by some of the same authors, the Dark Angels were written by a number of different people. So Mike Scanlon authors book 6, the 6th book in the entire series, Descent of Angels, and it is about Caliban before the coming of the Imperium. It's a Horus Heresy novel in which there is not even any Space Marines until, the last half of the last third of the novel. It's slow. It's really, really slow. And there's some really great background and interesting building of characters, whatever else. But some of it, in my opinion, reads kind of like fan fiction. It just isn't all that interesting. Fallen Angels is a little bit better, and it shows some of the other things that are going on in the story. This one is written by Mike Lee, It's a marked improvement over the first book in the Dark Angels series, I guess. But still, it's just really slow, and it doesn't necessarily progress things along at enough of a pace, considering how, I don't know, the Horus Heresy should feel urgent, and this book doesn't necessarily have that urgency either. Once they get into the Theramis Crusade, and this is when Gav Thorpe starts to write, he writes Descent of Angels, and there's just not a consistent concept or feel as to what's going on. The Lion seems kind of just like an aloof jerk. The fallen angels, or the characters who are going to become the fallen, betraying Dark Angels, I think are much more interesting, which is cool. And I'm actually working on a force of Dark Angels for myself right now that are in fact going to be those same fallen angels. But regardless, it's just not as compelling. And I don't really think I've met a Dark Angels player who really is really happy with these books. Tell me if I'm wrong. Now, it's not fair just to throw this all on Gav Thorpe. It's really definitely not fair to Mike Lee or Mike Scanlon, really, because it's these three guys who are obviously trying to do something interesting, but maybe the lack of editorial oversight, or perhaps it's the lack of a unified vision with what's going to happen there. Who knows? But regardless, it just makes for an uneven read, and it's not a super pleasant experience in my mind as to enjoying the Dark Angels in the Age of Darkness. Okay, now we're really going to make somebody upset. We're going to talk about the Thousand Suns, and we're going to talk about the Space Wolves at the same time. All of the Space Wolves and Thousand Suns fans listening at home just got upset. The Thousand Suns fans, had to powder their nose, and the Space Wolves probably had to gnaw on a chair leg or something to keep themselves under control. Regardless, both of these legions, for my money, end up together on the C tier. A couple of good things, a couple of good stories, and then a lot of other stuff. I did really enjoy reading both Prospero Burns and Thousand Suns. I think it was a cool idea to have those stories told. For those of you who don't know, if you've not read these books, it's the story of the attack and the raising of Prospero by the Space Wolves, and it's told first from the perspective of the Thousand Suns, and then from the perspective of the Space Wolves. And it does make for a really interesting pairing, and I think it's a cool idea, and it was pretty decently executed, I think. I enjoyed the Thousand Suns book a little bit more than I enjoyed the Space Wolf version, but that's neither here nor there. The big thing about these legions, I think, is that there are a couple things for each of them. Their identities are anchored in a way that I just don't think were realized as well as they could have been. The Thousand Suns are they're the concept of their arrogance, their dependency upon the warp, all of that. It's very well established, and we definitely can see that they're going to fall and that they're going to fail because they are delving into the powers of chaos without necessarily knowing that they're delving into the powers of chaos. So the arrogance and whatever else, it's established and whatever. But the biggest thing for me was the fact that I found Magnus to be entirely unlikable as a character. And it was a real problem for me when I was reading the book. Now, I get that I think you're supposed to think of him as arrogant because it's one of his defining characteristics and whatever else. But he is so, for me, infuriating in this book with his arrogance, and especially when the secret is revealed towards the end about, well, the whole meme about Magnus doing nothing wrong. Yeah, he did a lot of things wrong. He made a lot of very, 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 very bad choices. And I know that's part of the meme and whatever else, but it just makes it hard for me to care about what happens to him and his legion to a certain extent. Now, the Space Wolves, on the flip side, they try to occupy this interesting space. They are the misunderstood Space Marine Legion because they're not really savages. They're actually, very deep and soulful and whatever else. But there's another legion that I think accidentally does that whole thing better than the Space Wolves, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. And, all the focus on, I don't know, it's long-winded. It feels more like, especially Prospero Burns, it's definitely supposed to be modeled after that concept of the Skald's Tale, the retelling of an oral tradition, which is an interesting idea. And it's not necessarily badly done, but they, again, just don't quite fit, in my opinion. The other thing, too, is that I don't believe that, other than Layman Russ, I think the character... I'm sorry, other than the Lion, I don't think the character of Layman Russ is particularly consistent enough that I really necessarily understand him or can connect with him. The way he acts towards the Khan and the White Scars, once they arrive at Terra, his decision to go off on his own after Horus later on, his entire absence then from the siege. The whole cred and the idea as the super tough assassin, the Space Wolves are supposed to be a bunch of different things, and I don't really feel like any of it really successfully connects in the way that they are written. The Thousand Sons are present for the Siege of Terra in small bits. They're doing magic-y, psychic things, and Magnus does have some cool moments, especially once he is Magnus post-Prospero. But they seem like filler characters to me. They're not nearly as exciting or as compelling as like the Word Bearers. They're not as omnipresent as the World Eaters. They're just sort of there, and they kind of do their own thing. So for me, C-tier legions, both of them. Okay, saved one of the worst for last. Not really one of the worst. I'm placing the Imperial Fist at the B tier. There's some stuff, there's some stories that are okay, and then there's some other stuff. Is this Iron Warrior's bias? I mean, it could be. I just don't necessarily understand the niche that the Imperial Fists are supposed to occupy. Now, the Imperial Fists do have a surprising amount of depth in them as far as the characters. I enjoy Cambidias, Fafnir Ran. Sigismund is also sort of an interesting character. Sometimes he's written as just a plain jerk, other times he's written as a little bit more soulful. So a little bit of inconsistency there for me. Same thing with Alexis Pollux. I think his story, Fall, the short story Fall, is a really great short story about the void battle between the Iron Warriors and the Imperial Fist. That's a great story. But, sometimes he's just really dour. Sometimes he's very boring. And I mean, like, if Stiff Upper Lip was a legion, and it was the Imperial Fists, okay, for me, that's just not that interesting. They are all over the place for the Siege of Terra. Dorn is all over the place for the Siege of Terra, and Dorn has some really fun moments. He gets to duel Fulgrim. He gets to duel Alfarius. So, I mean, he's definitely present, and there are big things going on with him. But, for me, it's a B tier, because I just don't think they're that particularly exciting or different. They don't stand out in any way to me. Despite the fact that there are a couple of characters that I think are fun, like I said, Fafnir Ran, Sigismund, Cambidias, if you put those characters into another legion and told the story with that legion swap, I don't really think you'd lose much, in my opinion. I don't necessarily understand what the flavor is in the Imperial Fists and why it matters and how it's different from, somewhere between just the Ultramarines and the Dark Angels. Again, blow me up, tell me why I'm wrong, but I don't get it. So now we've come to the end, and there's one legion left, and I'm just going to open up and say it. The White Scars are an S-tier legion as far as their lore goes. I'll go to the mat on this one. The White Scars are a quality legion as far as their story goes. And what's most interesting to me about them is that Chris Raitt basically took a legion that had really no solid lore, or, they were basically uninvolved or a blank canvas. And he took a legion that almost nobody cared about and then wrote some fantastic and deep novels about them, to the point that, again, the Scars books, specifically Scars and then Path of Heaven, show up all over the place as people's favorite stories, even among people who have no interest of playing White Scars whatsoever. They're just really excellent stories. So part of this comes down to the fact that I think that the Jagatai Khan, out of all of the loyal Primarchs, has one of the most interesting stories. He is described as an outsider. And most importantly, he is not just described as an outsider, but it is demonstrated why he is an outsider. He exists on the fringe of the Imperium. He never truly agreed with the Emperor's view on the Imperial truth and what it meant. He openly disagreed with the Emperor on this. His closest friends during the heresy or before the heresy were Magnus and Horus, which, if you're keeping score, definitely didn't end up in the good guy column. When he finds out about the Horus Heresy, he finds out about the Istvan situation, he gets competing messages to either join one side or the other, and he doesn't decide right away. He takes a second to think about it. Scars is all about Jagatai Khan and the White Scars gathering up and going to Prospero to find out the truth about what happens to Magnus and the Thousand Sons, and then to make their decision on what happens next. So the books are really, really good, and if you haven't read them, please do so. I've said that a few times now, but I really mean it this time. Scars is all about the internal fighting in the White Scars as they decide what they're going to do. There's great guest appearances by Mortarion in this moment, because Horus sends Mortarion after the Khan to try to convince him to join up, and then the two of them set up in this book a really nice long and ongoing duel of sorts that pays off really nicely in Warhawk. Path of Heaven, similarly, is a great book. It's a great Emperor's Children story. There's great Eidolon is present. Great moments there. Really high stakes. Really interesting things going on. Development of some of the additional outside lore and discussion about the Webway project and whatever else. But just really compelling stuff. High stakes. The plot moves along. Well written. Memorable characters. All that good stuff. The Magyar Mazan, which, if you don't know what that is, I'm not going to say it now, but the creation of the Magyar Mazan and what it means for across that 2-book arc is really awesome, too. Similar to basically allowing the White Scars to have their own small Shattered Legions field, which is really cool. And then, of course, they get to the Siege of Terra, and they get to have all sorts of cool moments there. The Khan just has all these fantastic one-liners, quips, with, basically being like, yeah, I understand that there are rules and there are things you want me to do, but also I do these things myself. He gets these fantastic moments. Disagreeing with Dorn, Sanguinius, whatever else. There's a funny moment in Saturnine where a couple of human orderlies, not orderlies, like generals, I believe, are a little bit overwhelmed, and the Khan basically just tells them to, touch grass. And it's just fun. Just fun character moments. And then the Warhawk. The Khan goes up against a fully demonic-empowered Mortarion in order to take back the Lion's Gate spaceport, which is something that was established in the lore, something that we all thought was going to happen, but still seeing it happen in the story was very rewarding and very exciting and compelling. They are well written. They do the same things. They occupy that bestial, savage, in air quotes, space that the Space Wolves do as well, but they also play the misunderstood outsider a lot better than the Space Wolves do. It's much more interesting. It's more defined. Their philosophy is outlined in those books, and then they get to play really awesome supporting role in the Siege of Terra as well. They're the easiest leap for me, the top. Now, I read those books, and I had to go out and get a White Scars army, and so I did, and so I play White Scars now. But I sure didn't until after I read those books. That was the moment when I was like, okay, I've got to do this. I've got to create this in some way. So in order to make this video, I did a little bit of research because I was curious. As I was drafting my tier list, I realized that my biases were going to, of course, heavily influence how this whole thing turned out. And I'm really hoping that some of you will let me know if you think I'm wrong. But in order to try to, just give myself a little reality check, I put together a little survey and asked a few questions. I sent it out to as many people as I could. And I asked for people's top 3 Horus Heresy novels. I asked them for their top 2 favorite short stories or novellas. And then I asked, if there's anything they wish they would have seen more of. I also asked what legions these people played. So first of all, we should talk about the fact that, interestingly enough, that one of the highest legions played was Thousand Sons. The next highest was Iron Warriors, and each of them hovered about, 18% of the respondents played both of those legions. So a really high percentage played those two legions. So Blood Angels, World Eaters, Ultramarines, Death Guard, Raven Guard, and Alpha Legion were all pretty even, with roughly 15% of respondents playing those. Imperial Fists and Word Bearers were roughly 10%. And then, let's see, everything else kind of followed, with the smallest amount being Space Wolves, Salamanders, and White Scars. So I thought that was very interesting to see so many Thousand Sons players and so few Space Wolves, Salamanders, White Scars, and Iron Hands. Iron Hands were also really low, with just barely more than the White Scars players. Now, with all that being said, with White Scars being so poorly represented in the people playing them, it was interesting then, of the respondents, we had 65 respondents, and Scars or Path of Heaven or Warhawk showed up in about 15 answers as one of their favorite books. And that I thought was extremely interesting. Another thing that was surprising to me, but maybe shouldn't be, was the Betrayer, which I talked about as being an excellent book, and No Fear showed up all over the place as well. Betrayer was actually the most popular choice by far, followed shortly by No Fear, and then, if I count all of the White Scars books together, the White Scars books. After that, there were a couple of other ones. The First Heretic showed up quite frequently. Quite a few people liked Saturnine as their favorite book. A couple of people saying Echoes of Eternity, then Legion, and then quite a few people who really appreciated one of the first 3 books of the whole series, with that Sons of Horus focus. Now, I already kind of talked about it, the fact there wasn't a ton of consistency with the short story and novellas, other than simply saying that the Sevatar short story and novella, which you should be reading right now. Why are you still listening to this video? Go read Sevatar. Or The Last Church, which is just a really cool book. One person said Nemesis was their favorite book, which I thought was really interesting, because I think Nemesis, similarly, that's the book about the assassins, and I thought that one was very silly. Interesting question for me, and these are all freeform, so there really isn't a lot to pull specifically from the data. But I asked what's something else that you were missing from the series, and there wasn't a ton of consistency in these responses, except for the fact that a lot of people really wanted more from the legions that didn't get much of the story. Basically, other than the ones that were at the Siege of Terra, people felt like some of their legions were shortchanged, including Raven Guard, Dark Angels, White Scars. A lot of times people complained that they didn't feel like the War Master actually interacted with the Primarchs that much, which I think is true. Some people specifically said, where the hell's Horus? 100%. I agree. More demons, said a couple of people, which I thought there were quite a bit of demons. I actually got a little bit bored with some of the demons sometimes, but I think it's interesting that a couple of people did want more demons. And then there were 3 people specifically who complained about the Death Guard and their lack of being center to the story, which I agree. I feel like they got a couple of them that were pretty good, but not enough, and that, they're leaving development on the table. So I think I'm going to go, and I might do another video on this topic, maybe talking about specific books that you should read, do more specific review. If that's something that you would be interested in, please let me know. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, all that fun stuff. Give me some feedback so I know what it is that I should be doing for the next one. But stay tuned, hopefully soon. I'm hoping to follow up soon with a video about Conrad Kurz and philosophy and the difficulties of applying real-world thoughts and ideas into a silly models and miniature games. Thanks so much for listening, for sticking around. I appreciate you, and talk to you soon.